Hello, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this important event. My name is Ted Falk, and I am an adjunct professor of Middle East history here at USD. Joining us are two of our colleagues to the north from UCSD and CSU San Marcos. Speaking first, Dr. Ibrahim al-Marashi is a professor at San Marcos, specializing in modern Iraq, but he has a wide, diverse array of interests, including military history, transnational politics, the history of epidemics, and biosecurity. His prolific writing has appeared in Time, the Kiev Post, and the New Arab. His most recent book is A Concise History of the Middle East. Dr. Michael Provence is a professor of Middle East history at UCSD. He frequently appears on KPBS, ABC, and in the Union Tribune when something bad is happening in the Middle East. His most recent book is The Last Ottoman Generation and the Making of the Modern Middle East. But there are some that say his greatest scholarly labor was as my PhD advisor. So please join me in welcoming Professors al-Marashi and Provence.
So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us on such a lovely day, spending it inside. And I also wanted to thank Ted for accepting my plea to have a talk on this subject. This was just, I simply asked, are you doing anything? And at my behest, he did. And so if all of you that are gathered here, this is all the hard work of Ted. And I would also highly recommend his talk at San Diego State not too long ago. That's also been recorded. But without further ado, I will be talking about, well, I'm going to be making two arguments. Hey, how's it going? So the first argument is this, is to give a brief history of Hamas. And then follow up with that by the way history has been securitized and weaponized, the historical metaphors that have been used in this lecture. So, before I do that, I want to start out with basically an exercise I do with students. In other words, how do we label various entities in the Middle East? So Sammy is a regular groupie, so you don't get to answer this. But in the 21st century, if I ask the question, what is the greatest non-governmental organization that transformed 21st century politics on the eve of the 21st century? For the students here, what would be the NGO that transformed the world as we know it? Any guesses? If you want to start off examples of NGOs, it could be anything from Amnesty International, Greenpeace. Does anyone have a guess on the NGO, the non-governmental organization that transformed, hey, Jawad Shlonik, Shachwarik, that transformed 21st century politics? Anyone wants to take a guess? Is it Greenpeace, you would say, Amnesty International, World Wildlife Fund? Yes? Yeah. United Nations. So the United Nations is technically a multilateral organization. So not entirely non-governmental, but many governments forming an alliance coming together. The Red Cross? Anyone would say that? I wish. It's an NGO that came much earlier. What about an NGO on the eve of the 21st century? This is also a stalling tactic while people come in and have a seat. I'm glad the room is filling up. It's our kind of, it's a twisted warm-up. What if I said the NGO that transformed the world as we know it on the eve of the 21st century is Al-Qaeda? Yes. Now, I want you to think about it. Is Al-Qaeda non-governmental? Is it an organization? Its official name is Tanzim al-Qaeda. The name is in Arabic, it uses the word organization in it. In fact, that was what separated Al-Qaeda from another faction within that wanted to be a state, the Islamic State. Okay. Why do I do this exercise in the way we describe political entities in the Middle East? This is the various key players and notable relationships in the Middle East. And in fact, there is a URL that if you go to that will take you to all of these various alliances. Basically, what I find fascinating in the key players and notable relationships in the Middle East is notice how there's a category for Hamas. Okay. What is Hamas? It's been labeled a terrorist group, but beyond being just a terrorist group, it's been labeled as an Iranian proxy. It's been labeled, what I'm going to argue is, what we're seeing here, it's a non-state actor. Hamas is a non-state actor along with that it's almost a quasi-state, you see. Now, why do I insist on, or why am I trying to kind of label it as a non-state actor? It's for the following. Do we see how in the Middle East in the 21st century, how many non-state actors have evolved? Al-Qaeda is technically a non-state actor, okay? But that non-state actor, along with Hezbollah, if you want to call it a Iranian proxy, I would argue that another group called Islamic Jihad is more of an Iranian proxy. So this is one of the first myths I want to kind of address in the way we try to describe the ontology, the essence of Hamas. But also, what do you see here? Multilateral organizations such as the EU, Russia right there, the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda. And the key about Hamas is, I know you can't make out anything from this map, but it's just I want you to kind of appreciate the complexity. And also the fact that Hamas wasn't always an Iranian ally. That's perhaps to say, as a non-state actor, I want you to realize that there's been tension, so on and so forth, in this relationship. So the first myth is this. Number one, it's an Iranian proxy. The other myth is using an kind of an element from Jewish folklore in what is today the Czech Republic, that Hamas was also an Israeli golem, okay? In other words, an entity that formed during the first Intifada of 1988 and then turned on its creator, just like the mythical golem. And if anyone wants to know what the golem looks like, I took this picture here not too long ago in front of a simulacrum of a golem. So we have two myths, Hamas between Iranian proxy and Israeli creation. And what I'm going to argue is that the historical record shows it's neither. And so in other words, try to situate the history of Hamas in between these two metaphors we use to describe it. So, as you have three historians here, I want you to basically get an appreciation of the role of history in helping us understand current politics. So on one level, what contribution does history make to help us understand the current crisis? And then on the other level, how history itself can be weaponized. So just a reminder, studying history will sometimes make you uncomfortable. Studying history will sometimes make you feel deeply upset. Studying history will sometimes make you feel extremely angry. If studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. Okay. And then the next quote is this. History is the most dangerous concoction the chemistry of mind has produced. Its properties are well known. It sets people dreaming, intoxicates them, engenders false memories, exaggerates their reflexes, keeps old wounds open, torments their leisure, inspires them with megalomania or persecution complex, and makes nations bitter, proud, insufferable, and vain. History can justify anything you like. It teaches strictly nothing, for it contains and gives examples of everything. And since October, we've witnessed this. And so let me explain. The first is the history of Ibrahim. Okay. And this was an article that came out before a political agreement was negotiated by the Trump administration known as the Abraham Accords. A set of accords that have now been questioned. Have they been jeopardized? The normalization of relations from states such as Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, all the way to Morocco with Israel. On the eve of this current crisis, it was thought that Saudi Arabia, under this rubric, would normalize relationships. Its relationship with Israel. This article came out well before the actual political agreement, known as the Abraham Accords. But I'm going to bring in Abraham in the first of many metaphors that I've already introduced, Abraham the golem. This is is the definition of hubris? Trying to put the Arab-Israeli conflict into a single infographic, as here. And even with this infographic, what I'm going to do now for the remainder of the time together is look at what is missing in this attempt. Now, this was an infographic I collected in 2014. It's not only woefully out of date, but nevertheless, the events that precede October 2023 are still, this is a useful jumping point. So first, let us begin. I'm going to be talking about history and historical metaphors. So let's look at the various historical metaphors that have been invoked. Okay, this is more or less a digression into the securitization of history. Okay, it's my argument that the past can be weaponized, that has been weaponized. Okay, why does this happen? I argue the past is often invoked to give legitimacy in the present and suggest inevitability in the future. So let's look at some of the historical tropes that have been invoked, probably without the realization of how they could backfire. Okay. So the first is this: on the immediate, with the immediate escalation of hostilities in October, the immediate reaction was, this is a repeat of October 1973. Okay, how does that serve in this case, in terms of the Israelis? How was that a useful metaphor? Was this: if the past legitimizes the present, it's the following. We've been attacked in 1973. It was a surprise attack launched by Syria and Egypt. Nevertheless, what's the inevitability suggested in the future? Israel will prevail. Despite the setback, we will prevail. And hence, that was the value of the 1973 metaphor. And I'll examine it. Now, for the actors that are probably invoking the 1973 metaphor, particularly this administration around Benjamin Netanyahu, they're probably not realizing what happened to the incumbent Israeli government in 1973. They got voted out of office during the next elections. Okay, so that's why sometimes I say when you use the historical metaphor, sometimes it can backfire. So this is a history of historical metaphors. 1973 was almost immediately invoked. Then 9/11 was invoked, that this is Israel's 9/11. And if it gives legitimacy in the present, that historical metaphor was probably used to gain a sympathetic audience in the United States. Both Pearl Harbor and 9/11 were invoked around the same time, just a few days later. But again, using the argument I've developed, 9/11 is also informative, and a very interesting podcast emerged by Ezra Klein of the New York Times talking about the dangers of invoking that metaphor. Because it might legitimize you in the present, but what is it suggesting? That Israel might be engaging in a war that knows no end, okay? That would last 2 decades. Again, that's a dangerous historical metaphor. Then what happened was the invocation of the Holocaust. And even one of the most popular historians of our era, Yuval Noah Harari, invoked that metaphor and made references to the Hamas rampage in the various kibbutzim, analogous to the Einsatzgruppen who marched onto Ukrainian territory, executing people on the site. Okay. I would say, again, that is the weaponization of the past. And for a couple of reasons, is that Hamas never had the military machine of Nazi Germany. Okay, it never had the camps that Nazi Germany set up, and also for another reason, it's the following. If anything, if you're going to invoke a historical metaphor, let's be a bit more imaginative. I would say this is more like the Tet Offensive. Okay. And why I say that, for any of you, and so I'm going out of the region specifically, the Tet Offensive demonstrated that despite America's military might, how vulnerable it was, and its mission was in Vietnam. Okay. And I think that was it. It's that it demonstrated no matter what superior military assets one entity can possess, okay, as long as the other party has the will to continue and fight, okay, a connection to this land, okay, that you could bomb a population into submission. It doesn't mean you will achieve victory, and that's why I would say the images of the dead Hamas fighters are on the road, right, in Israeli territory. That's the memory it brought. Okay, it was those dead Viet Cong fighters on the outskirts of the U.S. Embassy. So, having said that, then that's just a digression on the historical metaphors. Now, what can history teach us is the following. There was nothing inevitable about the rise of Hamas or Hezbollah, that both are the products of a history of Israeli counterterrorism that backfired. What do I mean by this? If you look at the two greatest security threats to Israel at this moment on its borders or within its borders is Hamas and Hezbollah, but we have to look at the kind of injunctures in history in which they emerged. And for this attempt at hubris is valuable because you'll see here in 1982, the first Lebanon War, which is technically, again, a misnomer because the first Lebanon War is right here. It's March 1978. Okay. When Israel invaded Lebanon, it was to expel its greatest threat at the time, the Palestine Liberation Organization, from its northern borders. And sure enough, that military incursion succeeded of expelling the PLO from Lebanon, forcing the PLO to take up a headquarters in Tunis. What Israel's long-term mistake was, it decided to occupy a strip of the south of Lebanon so that in the vacuum, another threat could not emerge from the Palestinian groups. Okay, and that was his mistake. There was nothing inevitable about the Shia of Lebanon forming Hezbollah. In fact, a good number of the Shia of Lebanon were originally fighting the PLO in the south. A good number of the Shia of Lebanon believed that the PLO's presence there invited Israeli retaliation, that they suffered disproportionately because of the presence of the PLO. When Israeli forces crossed over the border, a good number of Shia might have not said it openly, but did not mind that the PLO was using the south of Lebanon as a base. Okay. Nevertheless, in that vacuum, a group did emerge in the long term that probably Israel could have not anticipated, and that was Hezbollah. Hezbollah was born out of the Israeli decision to occupy the south of Lebanon, and from that point onwards would go on to become one of Israel's greatest security threats to this point. A similar lesson from 1982 can be learned in 1987. Again, that is, you're not seeing here. What is missing is another conflict that would be known as the Intifada. What sparked the Intifada of 1987? A couple of factors. But one of them was actually an attack using paragliders across the border, an attack launched by a group known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command. Two paragliders flew from Lebanon into the north of Israel. A skirmish ensued. Okay, and that was emblematic because if you remember the image of what, of course, surprised me when I saw the images of paragliders in this recent bout of conflict was that I saw kind of a whole naval aerial flotilla of them, and I thought what began in 1987 as a result of simply two paragliders flying from the north, from Lebanon into Israel. In that uprising, again, Israel's primary threat were secular Palestinian groups. Okay? The fear that the PLO might take and hijack the Intifada. In fact, and again, Israel assassinated one of the members of the PLO in Tunisia at that time to prevent this from happening. And in that regard, this is where the Israeli golem myth began. Israel, the best answer could be, say, turned a blind eye to the emergence of Hamas. Okay, a religious alternative to the PLO. Okay, now to make a long story short, the figure that you see here, Yitzhak Rabin, okay, eventually a couple of years later would make peace with the PLO. Okay, what was Israel's greatest threat now becomes a partner, but what has emerged in the meantime was in that attempt to always balance the PLO, Hezbollah and Hamas have emerged, okay, as a result of events that Israel enabled, we can say, okay, and that is the other lesson of history. History is the study of irony, of unintended consequences, that in its attempt to eliminate the PLO eventually becomes Israel's partner, but in the wake of Israel's war against the PLO, its two greatest threat would emerge in the 21st century, Hamas and Hezbollah. And that's the ultimate lesson of history. Now, the other irony is this. Again, in terms of the history of Israeli counterterrorism, in the 1990s and then in the early 2000s, Israel assassinated the leader of Hezbollah, last name Hussein Mousawi. And then the early 2000s, it assassinated the spiritual leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Okay. And again, here's the study of another consequence, is the study of irony, of unintended consequences. In both cases, we could see what did that assassination lead to. Hussein Mousawi's replacement was today Hassan Nasrallah, somebody a lot more charismatic than his predecessor. And in the case of Hamas, okay, the assassination of Sheikh Yassin, somebody who kind of steered Hamas to balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who was more than happy to accept Saudi patronage. The successors were Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mash'al, much more charismatic. Okay. Sheikh Yassin was bound to a wheelchair. And somebody who also, these two who steered Hamas closer to Iran as well. Okay. So if you can see the pattern here is repeating over and over again the unintended consequences. Now, again, I just want to remind you there was nothing inevitable of Hamas working with Iran. And in fact, in 2013, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, the three of them had a falling out, okay? Particularly as Hezbollah and Iran decided to support Syria in its civil war. Really, what you're witnessing now is nothing inevitable about this alliance, is that Hezbollah and Hamas have kind of had a rapprochement, okay? And same with Iran. Okay? There's no indication that Iran gave a green light for this attack, okay? But at the end of the day, you see, what I'm trying to do here is to just basically say that that there's nothing inevitable about it. But ironically, for every attempt to blame Iran, what am I witnessing here is an attempt by the current Israeli government to deflect blame. Okay? That this wasn't the product of our policy of letting the situation in Gaza fester. Okay? That this was an outside plot that led to this current problem. So to conclude, if we want to look at historical 1973, one of the best histories, I would say, is World War Z. I use this to teach the craft of history in my undergraduate history metaphor, written by one Max Brooks, okay? Where you see here how a zombie attack, okay? How in the 1973 war, look at this, okay? The Israeli scientist, when he was talking about how did we let our country get overrun by zombies, in October 1973, when the Arab sneak attack almost drove us into the Mediterranean, we had all the intelligence in front of us, the warning signs, and we simply dropped the ball. We never considered the possibility of an all-out coordinated conventional assault from several nations, certainly not on our holiest of holidays, okay? And basically just replaced nations with Hamas in October 2023, and this sentiment repeats itself. Okay. Any Palestinian whose family had once lived within the borders of Israel, the last part applied to my family, refugees from the 1967 war of Zionist aggression. Again, this is from World War Z, a book on the zombie apocalypse, okay? At the heating of the PLO leadership, we had fled our villages believing we could return as soon as our Egyptian and Syrian brothers had swept the Jews into the sea. Again, he doesn't get the history exactly right. But nevertheless, it just shows you the powerful of metaphors in this. This is the whole reason I'm showing it. And finally, this is an image that might look familiar to you. In fact, this is a picture from 1991. Okay, these are Iraqi Scuds hitting Israeli cities. And why do I invoke that? Because the same metaphors were invoked then. Why did Iraq use Scuds to target Israel back then? Okay, in an attempt that really would have never dictated the outcome of the 1991 Gulf War. It was symbolic. It's hard to imagine, but both Ted Falk and I come from a generation, as well as Michael Provence, that remembers when people in this area really thought peace would happen any day now. Okay. When I went to Jerusalem in 1999, it's hard to imagine that you could go to Jerusalem and then 15 minutes later you could be in Ramallah, and vice versa, that you could go back and forth relatively easy. And a friend of mine named Khalil Shakaki really did think that peace was around the corner. Why do I invoke this? Because during those heady days, I remember one time getting into a not a police car, a taxi cab. And when the taxi driver, big difference, when the taxi driver asked, while going to Ramallah, where I was from, and when I said Iraq, he brought up this metaphor. Not this metaphor, sorry, but in 1999, he was saying, what did Iraq do for us in 1999? Okay. And the fact was this: it didn't achieve any military objectives for Iraq. But what did it do for Saddam Hussein? He won the battle of memory. At least you struck Israel on our behalf, he was saying to Saddam Hussein. Okay. And for this, I remember you, that in other words, it wasn't a military victory, but it exposed Israel's weaknesses. Okay. And I want you to think about this, right? Hamas is not going to win a military victory, okay, out of this. Okay. But what happened in early October, I want you to think, how will it be remembered generations later? Okay. And finally, if you want to have two lessons about how kind of the past can backfire, I recommend two films. The first is Waltz with Bashir. Okay, this animated series where if you can see kind of this plane bombing the south of Lebanon and having kind of history backfire. This is one level of how military solutions can backfire. And the other one is Munich, okay? Munich is really a post 9/11 film. It's not about the Mossad conducting a series of assassinations in the 1970s. Munich is basically saying violence didn't bring any peace to Israel as a result of killing those who were allegedly behind the Munich Olympic massacre. And then a quite interesting film, that's supposed to be Golda Meir in the film Munich, is another film called Golda Meir that just came out, which I was watching on the plane over here from Spain before the flight attendant told me to close my screen. But I'm not sure if that has a good lesson. It seems does. It seems eerily where Golda Meir is being grilled. How did she let this attack happen in 1973? Okay. And then finally, if you want just another history lesson, I'm going to toot my own horn. I wrote this right before a hospital, the Ahlil Arab hospital, was attacked. Okay. And even then, when writing the history of Hamas, what did I warn of? Nobody knows when or if this cycle of responsive violence will end. But we know that in the past, Israel's aggressive counterterrorism and the focus on the threat at hand, helped fuel the rise of Hezbollah and Hamas. To end this cycle, Israel needs a long-term strategy to address the root causes of terrorism: socioeconomic deprivation, failure of governance, loss of hope, despair, and anger among Palestinians. Israel's failure to do so has led to thousands of deaths and sadly promises many more to come. That was a couple of weeks ago, in the first week of this fighting. Again, thank you so much.
Again, thank you, Ibrahim, for joining us today. Let me find my slides. So I wanted to talk a little bit about historical memory, as well as current politics, current Israeli politics and current Palestinian politics. Because the question I get asked most of the time is, what's the solution? What comes next? And I am at a loss for what comes next, except that it will probably get worse before it gets better. There's a saying that every general is fighting the last war. In regards to the Syrian conflict, there are people from that administration who said that President Obama did not want to arm the Free Syrian Army opposing the government of Bashar al-Assad because of the memory that some of the Afghan mujahideen fighting the Soviets in the 80s evolved into the Taliban, that the fear of that historical metaphor dictated his policy towards Syria. So too, I think nations and peoples are often reliving their last trauma. So following Ibrahim's discussion, let me invoke three traumatic historical memories: 9/11, the Holocaust, and the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe. I think many Israeli Jews are living in fear of another Holocaust, no matter how far-fetched that may seem with Hamas's lack of a state, air force, etc. But that fear is real. That fear that their neighbors will knock on their door one night to kill them. And I think on October 7th and since then, this was in the front of many Israelis' minds. The same token, I think many Palestinians are living in fear of another Nakba. When in 1948, between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians were expelled or fled the war from what became the State of Israel and were prevented from returning to their homes by Israeli policy. So when northern Gaza City, was ordered to be evacuated by the Israeli military, the Nakba was in the front of Gazans' minds, that if we leave now, even for safety, will we be allowed to return? And today there are nearly 800,000 internally displaced Palestinians in Gaza from Gaza City. I'll present another point that I don't think tragedy makes us righteous. There's this kind of myth of victimization or the ennobling power of persecution or victimization. But I think being victimized makes most people sad, bitter, and angry. And we can't think straight while we are grieving or angry. There's the term a blind rage. It blinds us from thinking rationally. So let's turn to 9/11, which is the parallel that a lot of Israelis have put forward, the shock attack on civilians. And let's turn to what came after. And I think that shows that scared, grieving, and angry nations can make terrible mistakes and jeopardize their own future and their own security in the name of getting revenge. Continuing down the path we're on, that Israel is on, and the path that the United States followed after 9/11, could turn another horrible crime into another global catastrophe. In the American response to 9/11, we invaded one country that was tangentially related to the attacks and one that had nothing to do with it. In doing so, following Ibrahim's point, we unleashed forces we could not comprehend or predict. These policies not only failed to defeat terror, not least because it's impossible to defeat an abstract noun, but created the conditions that made the world less stable and safe for everyone. In pursuit of al-Qaeda, America went from having the world's sympathies on 9/12 to being the bully again. You all might not have thought about the images of torture and humiliation from Abu Ghraib in a while, or stories about Guantanamo in a while, but I promise you the Arab world and the Islamic world have not forgotten those horrific images. That strengthened extremism rather than defeating it. America's pursuit of terrorism and the war on terror made more people angry with America, not fewer. And so I'll say that the 10,000 dead Palestinians, which is where we are today, won't bring back those 1,400 dead Israelis. But it will traumatize a new generation of Palestinians who will want revenge. So the question I get is, what are the prospects for peace? What comes next? And this is why I show the slide of Mahmoud Abbas, because I am not optimistic, and I think there needs to be a new generation of leadership, because we face a crisis of legitimacy in the Israeli peace camp, the quote-unquote liberal Zionist two-state solution, as well as the two-state Palestinian leadership, now that we are 30-odd years into what was supposed to be a Palestinian state by 1999. And so I propose that the gerontocracy, this is one thing that Palestinians have in common with Americans, that we're ruled by 80-year-olds. They cannot solve this problem. Netanyahu's political career may not survive this war, but I also don't think that means Israeli politics are moving towards support for a two-state solution. Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, is 87 years old, and he is not the man for the moment. Nor do I think Joe Biden is the leader we need to guide us through this catastrophe. Since Yasser Arafat's death in 2002, Abbas has presided over roughly a third of the West Bank in sort of a statelet, while preserving security cooperation with Israel. He owes his position in power to the two-state solution, and can't really challenge Israeli policy. He is deeply unpopular in Israeli politics, which have not had an election since 2006. He's viewed as extremely corrupt, so the people who are loyal to him are loyal for their jobs or their payoffs. He is disliked so much that he's occasionally shouted down when he visits refugee camps like Jenin earlier this summer after an Israeli raid. He was trying to show sympathy for the people, and they looked at him and said, what are you doing for Palestinians? And he will not challenge the status quo. And so that leads to, much more radical groups like the Lion's Den emerging in Jenin and Nablus and Hebron. He recently said that, maybe the Palestinian Authority that he oversees will return to Gaza after the current conflict if a political solution is found. But if the Palestinian Authority can't protect Palestinians in the West Bank from settlers or from the Israeli army, why would Gaza Palestinians believe that he could improve anything for them? So what alternatives do we have? Probably the most popular non-Hamas politician is Marwan Barghouti. He is in prison for ordering attacks during the Second Intifada, but many think he was actually in prison for his role in organizing the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. The departed former Israeli president Shimon Peres said that he would pardon him if he was elected. Peres was elected and did not pardon Barghouti. However, the last real polling of Palestinians shows that he's the only alternative who could actually win an election against Hamas leadership. So he was excluded in 2011 during the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange. So Gilad Shalit, an Israeli military officer, was captured at Kerem Shalom, right on the border of Israel, Egypt, and Gaza, held for 5 years, and ended up being exchanged for over 1,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Some being held without charge under administrative detention, some who were convicted of large crimes. And people included in that transfer included the head of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, who had a lot more blood in his hands than Marwan Barghouti. So many think that this was a strategic tactic, that they would release Hamas prisoners, but not the genuinely popular figure who could challenge Abbas and challenge the status quo in the Palestinian Authority. The other figure who's angling to replace Mahmoud Abbas is Mohammed Dahlan. He had been a protege. He was in Fatah, and he was the one that attempted to oust Hamas during the period of cohabitation, when there was a unity government, including both Hamas and other Palestinian parties. He has a long history of working closely with Israeli security services and American security services. And after losing his position in Gaza, he moved on to the Emirates. And so some people think that it was his quest for Palestinian leadership that played a part in the Abraham Accords, that he was advising the Emirates and Bahrain to normalize with Israel to secure his position as successor. He is not viewed positively by most Palestinian factions, except those who he dispenses patronage to because of his connections in the Emirates. On the Israeli side, Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, is the defining figure of the second half of Israeli history. If the first half was defined by David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, and Yitzhak Rabin, he is the second half of Israeli history. Ben-Gurion and Rabin were heroes of the establishment of Israel in 1948 and their victories in 1967. Menachem Begin pivoted from being an Irgun terrorist to being the peacemaking prime minister, making peace with Egypt in the Camp David Accords. And Rabin, after his military victories, realized that an endless occupation of those territories captured in 1967 was ultimately not in Israel's strategic interest. Now, Netanyahu has built his career on promising that a Palestinian state would not come into being. He was speaking at a rally where people were chanting for Rabin's death, and Rabin was killed a few weeks later. During the lead up to the 2015 election, he promised his voters that there will be no Palestinian state on my watch. And he later said the Arabs are coming out in droves to try to whip up his base. And he repeated this to the Trump administration in 2019. And they attempted to placate him with the deal of the century that basically turned the West Bank into Swiss cheese and compensated them with some empty pieces in the Negev or Naqab desert. He will not remove settlements. That was political suicide for one of his predecessors, Ariel Sharon, who lost the support of his own Likud party after dismantling settlements in Gaza. And he says that he does not want Israelis living under the Palestinian Authority, so he does not want a Palestinian state in the West Bank. And so we're stuck with a situation in which there are two sets of laws for people in the West Bank, that Israeli settlers are tried according to Israeli civil law, and Palestinians are tried in military courts that can use secret evidence, have something like a 99% rate of conviction, and no mechanism to challenge secret evidence. So you can be convicted and not be able to see the evidence that convicted you. And an Israeli activist challenged this recently, Jonathan Pollock. He was arrested for throwing a rock at a police vehicle in the West Bank during the expansion of a settlement and the closure of a road. And he said, I want to be tried in the military courts like Palestinians who are protesting alongside me. He was rejected. He was sent to an Israeli civil court to be prosecuted. So in the 2010s, Netanyahu, in place of the two-state solution, proposed economic peace, that maybe Palestinians would give up the dream of an independent country if the economy in the West Bank improved. But he didn't really follow through on that. So the quality of life, I mean, even if we follow that logic, that he didn't really follow through on improving the day-to-day lived existence of West Bank Palestinians. And in his political trouble, he's under indictment. He had to form narrower coalitions with extremist parties that want settlement expansion and indeed, want more confrontation with Palestinians rather than less. Some are hopeful that the horrible attacks on October 7th could revive the peace process. That many think that because that Egypt's action in 1973 brought Israel to the table to eventually negotiate the Camp David Accords. By upending the status quo, you can change the situation on the ground. I'm not optimistic, and I don't think that's particularly likely. I think the end result is that Israelis are more afraid and angry with Palestinians, and Palestinians are more afraid and angry with Israelis. And in the result is that more people want revenge, rather than some sort of coexistence. So what do we have left? There is no real peace process left, and there hasn't been for about 15 years. Even if Yair Lapid, who was caretaker prime minister of Israel briefly in 2022, he's probably the most popular person who actually wants a two-state solution. Even when he got the most seats in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, he still had to form a coalition with settler and right-wing parties in order to form a government. So he couldn't, you need 61 seats, and every government is a coalition. So he will always need people who don't want a Palestinian state if he wants to be prime minister. I think I think that the two-state, my apologies for this mess of trying to explain Israeli politics. It's not just left-right. There's secular, religious, two-state annexation. So even if he could get the most votes, he would need someone down here in order to form a government. And many of even people who want a two-state solution won't sit in a government with the Arab Joint List. I think. And so Netanyahu is forced to deal with much more extreme elements. I think the one-state solution of a Israel-Palestinian true democracy of one person, one vote, I think that is similarly unlikely. I think this has support from progressive Jews in the West, as well as many Palestinian and Arabs on the left. But I don't think that really reflects popular opinion among Israelis or Palestinians. Israeli Jews will not accept becoming a minority in Israel. And even many Israelis who might support a one-state solution do not want the return of Palestinian refugees from Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And many Palestinians themselves don't want this because they don't believe that Israel will change. They don't believe that a self-defined Jewish state will respect their human rights, their civil rights, their property rights, or their desire for national self-determination. And they can point to discrimination suffered by Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. To quote James Baldwin, "The flag we pledge allegiance to has not pledged allegiance to us." And this is the more troubling outcome other than two-state or one-state, because these are the extremists, the religious Zionists in two allied parties led by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who recently acquired 24,000 automatic weapons from the United States to distribute to Israeli settlers as well as Israelis in 1948 Israel. As we know as Americans, I'm sure adding a whole lot of guns to a crisis surely can improve things. So Smotrich had a plan in 2017. I think he correctly recognized that the two-state solution was dead, and so he wanted something much worse. He wanted to annex the West Bank without giving citizenship to Palestinians in the West Bank. He said they would have municipal councils, but not the right to vote in national elections. He also called for the compensated expulsion of Palestinians with national ambitions. That is, if a Palestinian wanted a state, they could not stay, and they would be paid to move to Jordan or elsewhere. Condoleezza Rice also recommended resettling Palestinians in Chile and Argentina with compensation. So I think we can contrast the current state of the far right in Israel with the founder of the far right, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. He was seen as an extremist by fellow Zionists in the 1920s, 30s, and he died before the establishment of the state. But I think he understood that Palestinians were a nation long before many Zionists could recognize and come around to that fact. And almost exactly 100 years ago, on November 4th, 1923, he published a piece called The Iron Wall. And he says, our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools who we can deceive by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon to us their claim to priority in Palestine in return for cultural and economic advantages. I repudiate this conception of the Palestinian Arabs. They feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico, and the Sioux for their rolling prairies. To imagine, as our Arabophiles do, that they will voluntarily consent to the realization of Zionism in return for material conveniences which the Jewish colonist brings with him is a childish notion, which has at the bottom a kind of contempt for the Arab people. It means that they despise the Arab race, which they regard as a corrupt mob that can be bought and sold, and are willing to give up their fatherland for a good railway system. Jabotinsky goes on to call for the building of a metaphorical iron wall of defense, that only once the neighboring Arab states recognize that Israel or the Zionist project isn't going anywhere, that they won't leave, that will bring them to the table. And I think he was proven generally correct, that the military victories of Israel in 48 and 67 eventually brought many Arab countries to the table and made peace with Israel. And finally, even the PLO abandoned their hope for the liberation of historic Palestine in exchange for a Palestinian state on 22% of Palestine. But the religious Zionist attachment to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, rather than Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, means that the calculus of the Iron Wall cannot really play out, because they will not abandon any part of it. So I don't know where things are going, but I think they're going to get worse before they get better. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what I can add to these two masterful and profoundly depressing presentations, but I do want to say that it's a pleasure to be here, not least because I want to say something about my predecessors, your lecturers. You know, most of you are too young to remember the beginning of the 2003 Iraq War. But you know about it. There were no heroes, but there were a few heroes of academic freedom and honesty, and Ibrahim was one of them. So you should look him up, Ibrahim al-Marashi. And the next thing I want to point out is that as a teacher, the most cherished moment that one can possibly imagine is when your student becomes your colleague and invites you to their classroom or to meet their students. So Ted was my doctoral student, and I am literally bursting with pride at this moment. So I thought I'd share that with you. I was thinking about what to talk about today. I think I'll go over some of the same kinds of things and some of the same points that Dr. al-Marashi and Dr. Falk made. I was a graduate student in the I'm older than both of them, and I was a graduate student in the optimistic days of the 90s when we thought that the Oslo Accords might deliver a two-state solution, justice, and an end to the conflict over Palestine. My teacher was part of the delegation that went to Madrid for the first conference organized by the first Bush administration. And I lived in Syria from 1998 to 2000, again in 2002. And at that time, I went to the Golan, occupied by Israel in 1967, into the demilitarized zone, and saw the cities that were destroyed by the Israeli army when they withdrew. The fields that still have landmines visible in them and can't be used by anybody for any purpose, and the depopulated region there, and the actual border between Israel and Syria. and the Israeli security zone in South Lebanon, which at that time was still under Israeli occupation that Ibrahim mentioned. I saw it from a distance. Didn't want to get too close. We went through Syrian army checkpoints. We went through Lebanese army checkpoints. We went through Hezbollah checkpoints, and then finally we went through UN checkpoints. The UN checkpoints were buried; they were beneath the ground because the shelling from the Israelis was sufficiently intense that the UN observers had to live in bunkers. The entire beautiful countryside of South Lebanon was depopulated in those days. It happened that I was in Lebanon on the day that the IDF withdrew in the spring of 2000 by chance, and heard the artillery barrage covering the withdrawal. I got in a taxi and went back home to Damascus, and we heard the news on the radio. They've left after 20 years. And then I was in Damascus in the beginning of the second Intifada, and a little while later, in the fall of 2000. And the last talks between Arafat and the last Israeli Labor Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, the Clinton talks of 2000, and the Syrian track. And in 2005 and 2006, I was back and experienced the 34-day war between Lebanon and Israel. So what did those? I mean, this is not a. I'm not talking about history now. I'm just talking about memories. The thing that I remember most strikingly from leaving Syria in the midst of the Intifada, after the death of the president for 30 years, was that the abstraction with which people here in this country deal with suffering over there was intolerable, was obscene. And I remember, and I feel that strongly today when I listen to somebody like the Secretary of State say, well, we have to, a ceasefire, we're not ready for a ceasefire. We can't have a ceasefire. And I think back when I hear those words, and I think, you know, who are these people? What are they doing? What do they mean? What on earth can they be waiting for? And I remember Condoleezza Rice in 2006 during the Lebanon War, which I think is actually the correct historical analogy for what we're seeing today, in a way. And I'll just say something about that in a minute. When she said, we can't let, let's see, I wrote it down actually. It's burned into my consciousness. What we're seeing here, in a sense, is the birth pangs of a new Middle East. And whatever we do, we have to be certain that we're pushing forward to the new Middle East, not going back to the old Middle East. So I hear these things, and I see this, and I think, I mean, the world is full of people, but maybe not as many in the United States as there should be, or in Israel for that matter, as there should be, who say or ask or want to ask, how many grandmothers will it take, how many dead children does it take for those goals, whatever they are, that can't be articulated or even shared or discussed? How many will it take for those goals to be realized? And by God, what are those goals? And so I was thinking about the thing to ask, and I always want to ask over the years of teaching Middle Eastern history, and Ted for sure has heard this in the years when we were partners in the classroom. What is legitimate mass violence, and who decides? What violence is legitimate? And I think everybody should ask themselves that question and have an answer to that question. And I think that the corruption of the system that we see leading to this disaster and this suffering before us is that no one is asking this question. What is legitimate mass violence, and who decides? And what's not legitimate? Is it only legitimate if it's a state? And is any violence by the state legitimate? Well, this is a question that no one, there are people for sure protesting in Israel, protesting, many thousands of people on Saturday, in fact, who are asking this question and demanding that their political leaders at least ask the question. But it's not really as front and center as it should be, I think. There's other questions that occurred to me. What is the meaning of Zionism? What is the political project that Zionism represents, and how is that project served by if we can ask that question, how is that project being advanced by what we see? And what is the relationship? Dr. Falk has addressed this, I think, quite well, and the changes in the relationship between the project of liberation and protection for the Jewish people, Zionism in its most idealistic terms, and the relationship with the population of the non-Jewish population of historical Palestine. What is that relationship, and what should it be, and what are the? That's a discussion that doesn't take place. So these were some of the things that I was thinking about, and I think I'm not going to say too much more here, although I'll say something about. Ibrahim talked about the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. The invasion of Lebanon in 1982 came as an effort by the first Likud government of Menachem Begin and the defense minister Ariel Sharon to do something which you've heard a lot lately, and that is to say, and this is the precise formulation, to root out the terrorist infrastructure and to destroy the PLO. Okay? So this was the goal, the professed goal. The actual goal, and there was an actual goal, was to facilitate the annexation of the West Bank and the elimination of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from contention within the region. The failure was profound. It led to the destruction of the Israeli government, the finding of criminal negligence on the part of the defense minister, although he later rehabilitated himself, a massacre of Palestinian civilians, the expulsion of the PLO, the most destructive one-day casualty of U.S. Marines since Iwo Jima in the Marine Corps bombing, the end of the Lebanese government, and as Ibrahim pointed out very perceptively, the beginning of a new movement of opposition, which became Hezbollah. All of these things were results of that moment, and also, rooting out the terrorist infrastructure didn't work out so well. In 2006, the war that I witnessed at firsthand in Lebanon, the goals of the Israeli government of Ehud Olmert was to root out the terrorist infrastructure and eliminate Hezbollah. And the government of the United States, for the first time, extended this effort much longer than would otherwise have taken place, for 34 days, until the Israeli government eventually invaded Lebanon because there were no more targets. Everything that could be destroyed was destroyed. Bridges, ports, power plants, all kinds of stuff. And of course, the eventual ceasefire didn't do any of those things. Hezbollah was strengthened, and in fact is the only intact, functioning political entity in the state of Lebanon today. So in fact, the opposite was achieved. So rooting out the terrorist infrastructure, destroying, so what we have now is a situation where the bankruptcy of Netanyahu's government, which on the day before Hezbollah's attacks was, according to an Israeli colleague, Israel was on the brink of civil war, he said. I quote directly, an Israeli, the director of the Moshe Dayan Center, and that Netanyahu's threat of jail for stealing $30 million for corruption, his complete inability to do anything to improve the country, the exodus of young, educated people from the country, all of these things were on his plate, and he was facing, the biggest movement of popular opposition in Israeli history. So the bankruptcy of his government was plain, and the bankruptcy of Hamas in Gaza was plain, and the bankruptcy of the PA in the West Bank was plain, and Hamas first rescued Netanyahu from his destruction, and then Netanyahu rescued Hamas from its destruction, and then Biden rescued them both. So my question is, who will rescue us? And who will rescue the people of the region, the grieving Palestinians and Arabs and Israelis, from them? Who will rescue us from them? And so obviously the answer is we have to rescue each other. We have to rescue ourselves by rejecting again and again and again, like people did on Saturday, the bleak savagery and violence of their message and the cluelessness about what we all need, humans, and what we all share. So, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we have about 20 minutes left for questions. Was I brief? You're we can just pass around a microphone, but if you need to get to your next class or event, feel free to head on out. Anyone just want to start with a question? Yes.
Can you speak to the preferred method of collective punishment punishment engaged in by successive Israeli governments, the reasons why they engage in a policy and the results that they realized and the results that they hoped to have realized? Sorry, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't know if there's a particular logic or a strategic logic to it. I think it's wrong, and it lacks a strategy for what comes next. In that every bomb drop on Gaza will recruit people to Hamas rather than weaken their popularity or their hold. So it changes the calculus somewhat. Do either of you have anything to add on that?
Sure. Thanks. Well, sometimes this is called Ben-Gurionism. And the notion, there is a strategic doctrine, and it's called the doctrine. It's sometimes called within the IDF the doctrine of disproportionate response. So when a Palestinian or Arab force does an operation or some sort of attack against an Israeli force, the response, and this goes back to the early 50s, actually. The response is overwhelming and massively destructive. Now, the other thing that takes place, and I've witnessed this, but it's also happening in Gaza now, is that the Israeli government makes, the IDF that is, makes, it's not the government, it's the IDF, makes the claim that they don't target civilians, and that they make the claim that they are the most moral force, most moral military force in the world. And the argument goes like this. So the civilians are warned to leave a region, and they're told to leave, and they're leafleted. In these days they send text messages, but they used to send leaflets. I've seen these leaflets, and they say the government of the government of Israel, the military government of Israel, they're in Arabic, advises you to leave and will not be held responsible for what happens to you if you do not leave. And then, so people are terrified. Airstrikes are terrifying. You know, they terrify people. They're intended to terrify people. And then what typically happens, and I'll give you an example from my own experience here in a second, is that people are often targeted as they leave. And the cars and trucks and buses and even pedestrians are killed in airstrikes as they flee these areas. So we've actually seen this in Gaza as people have gone from the north to the south, and so this leads to complete panic and terror. Now, in my own experience, I left Beirut by bus to Damascus. And they left. You know, there was only one way out of the country. All the other bridges had been destroyed, and so we found a bus company, and it took us to Damascus. And we saw the detritus of airstrikes all along the road. You know, vegetable trucks, stuff like that. You know, and then the day after we arrived in Damascus, the Air Force started airstrikes on the empty buses on their way back. Right, so. You can ask yourself, what's this intended to achieve? But I think you can see, you know, they're not going to hit a bus full of, departing civilians, especially, say, Americans, people with U.S. passports, unhyphenated Americans, as it were. These are not people who they want to target. But empty buses, now that's going to make things different. So taxis fleeing, things like that, you know, this is a normal tactic that we see again and again and again during these kinds of times. So, I mean, to leave South Lebanon in 2006, you know, a taxi fare was $5, and then it was $50, and then it was $1,000, and then there was no taxis, and the taxi drivers were killed, you know, so.
To answer your question, Jawad, anticipating that question, I think this is a reflection of that policy. And you see, in theory, if it would work, the number should be ending. But remember, this is 2014, 10, 11, and 12. Those are all wars against this little piece of land. And of course, I've lost track. How many have there been since afterwards? 2023, 2021, so on and so forth. So, yeah, you see the history of it. Does it work? Is it effective? I mean, you can see the evidence for yourself. No.
I was wondering, so for nations and international organizations that want, obviously, there's a lot of people that have been hurt by this, like physically displaced. So I was curious, what are your guys' thoughts of how can international organizations and nations practice like conflict sensitivity and help while still, I don't know, like how can they help in this situation?
I mean, I think we have to speak truth to our allies. There's a lot of mass violence led by a government in Myanmar going on. The U.S. doesn't have real hooks into the government of Myanmar, Burma. But when there are human rights violations by our allies, like Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that is when those bilateral relations definitely need to come into play. We just donated 24,000 automatic weapons to be distributed to Israeli civilians, and I think that will escalate things rather than safeguarding Palestinian or Israeli life. But in terms of practical effects, the U.S. should stop vetoing calls for a ceasefire at the UN, because often it is that veto that can prevent greater international collective action. Gavin?
What do you think, is it possible for the people in Gaza to elect new governments anytime soon? Because with the Hamas people that are in power, they obviously do not have the best interests of the Palestinian people. In an interview on Saturday, they asked one of the Hamas leaders, you guys have all this money for shelter, you guys have all this money that you guys are putting into your underground shelters. What about to the Palestinian people? And they said that's the UN's job. Our job is for Hamas, as well as the leaders having billions of dollars in net worth. Is there a way for the new wave, the younger people in that area to elect a new government, or is it just so much of it a dictatorship over there?
It's a dictatorship, but I would say that Hamas is a prison gang. That whether you are an American or a Palestinian or whatever nationality and go to prison, you usually join a gang to survive. And so the siege on Gaza strengthens Hamas rather than weakens them. And the various Israeli strikes on Gaza over the last 12, 13 years, those have strengthened Hamas rather than weakening them. So opening Gaza to the world, opening its allowing Gazans to, transit to the West Bank to work in Israel. There are a lot of guest workers who had been working in Israel. I think that can lead to grassroots Palestinian mobilization because, they're popular as a resistance movement, not as a government. And so when, the siege ends, that will immediately weaken Hamas, in my view.
Yeah, if you look at history, when do sieges and sanctions work? Whether it's against the Caribbean island of Cuba, Iraq, Saddam benefited from the sanctions. It only strengthened his government. They aren't working against Vladimir Putin's government after the invasion of Ukraine. It's usually these kind of sanctions are a way of states to seem like they are doing something short of war, but without the acknowledgement that they usually strengthen the targeted incumbent rather than weaken them through these kind of siege busting activities. And so, in other words, if you're talking about kind of the billions that would go to, allegedly the billions that go to the kind of leaders of Hamas, we have to think, what was the economic system that was created that allowed them to enrich themselves in the first place? Maybe.
So Israel has claimed to know where Hamas operatives are hiding in Gaza, and I've heard the argument that if they did know this, why are they bombing the whole strip and not just sending special operations? So I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, I'll just answer from the military history perspective. Is any military force is loath to go into a urban setting where the defender has their advantage, so that even if they knew the operators, it's just easy to bomb the target and allow the quote-unquote collateral damage to ensue. It was the case of Fallujah in 2004, Mosul from 2017 onwards. That's just the easy military answer. You could know where the enemy is. It's either to bomb them from a distance than send your own folks in. It's the whole reason drone warfare was invented, exactly for that rationale. That's the easier perspective from a military historical legacy.
There are a lot of people in Gaza right now, and actually a lot of people across the planet, that think that this is a new phase of ethnic cleansing, of the Nakba that has started in '48. And that the West Bank will be the next phase. The 24,000 guns kind of suggest that, and the violence in the West Bank and genocide in Gaza suggests that. Be aware that you guys are historians, not prophets. Can you talk a little bit about where you see this going? If you think actually this is true, that this is another effort to displace possibly 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, possibly another 2 million plus from the West Bank, do you think that's possibly Israel's strategy at this point? Is this the right time for it, Chris?
Pardon me?
Yes, I'll let you take that.
You can do the prompt.
You want it?
I'll go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm afraid, but I also don't think much of the sagacity of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think his program is to survive and stay out of jail and keep his $30 million. No matter, it's like what they used to say about Hafez al-Assad. He'll fight to the last Lebanese. So I think Netanyahu will fight to the last IDF conscript. Never mind, how many. But that's not to say that that there's it's very frightening, and I think these people know. People like Netanyahu, people like, especially authoritarian political leaders, but even ostensible democratic political leaders know that a fait accompli, once accomplished, is very difficult to undo. So I think that, I find the lassitude of the American government just absolutely the most terrifying thing, because I think that Netanyahu believes he knows how to. He said many times he knows how to manipulate the American system, and so if they if they
Since
don't
1996.
right. So if the Biden administration is not. It's the only force that has the possibility of the Egyptians can't prevent the IDF from pushing 2 million people into the Sinai and they won't probably, So I find it really terrifying. It's a real nightmare to me personally, and I think to think about. So.
I might disagree with your last point, because I think for his own political survival, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi won't allow the displacement of 2 million Gazans into the Sinai, but not for any care for the Palestinian people.
That's a good point.
I think the Smotrich and Ben Gvir's in Netanyahu's cabinet will want to use the war as a cover to displace as many as possible. And as long as Netanyahu needs them to stay as prime minister, he might allow vigilante violence, maybe not conducted by the IDF, but by settlers, to encourage that movement. I was talking to a Syrian colleague about these events, and he said, Netanyahu learned the lesson of Assad, that you can get rid of millions of people you don't want and displace them if there is, you can surround a town and leave one way out, and we will see if that is expanded in the West Bank beyond just Gaza.
You had your hand up first.
Oh, sorry.
It's a two-part question. Well, thank you all for being here today. First part, came out yesterday morning that I guess the Minister of Heritage of Israel said that dropping the nuclear option on Gaza was, on the table, so to speak. So the first part is how does that kind of help the ceasefire kind of peace process? And the second part is that kind of statement tacitly confirms that Israel has nuclear weapons, which has kind of been unspoken for a while. And as far as I know, according to international law, the U.S. can't send weapons to states which possess nuclear weapons. So what sort of ramifications of that is going to have for the U.S. policy, kind of once all this is dropped up in one way or the other?
Probably few ramifications for U.S. policy.
Yeah, I don't really. The existence of something like 175 nuclear warheads is not anything that anyone can deny. So, it's it's hard to imagine, but lots of things are hard to imagine. So, I mean, I don't want to think about it.
Yeah, it's the worst kept secret in the Middle East. That it's interesting that nuclear opacity, right? You want the world to guess you have nuclear weapons without directly acknowledging it. Otherwise, then it brings in the whole non-proliferation treaty, right? But there's a word for it. It's called nuclear opacity. Even when Mossad conducted assassinations abroad and never claimed credit just for that sake of the opacity. And I find interesting that now who's benefited from this strategy is Iran. And that the whole world was guessing, did Iran give a green light for the attack? And by the whole guessing process, it bestows power on Iran. In other words, Iran doesn't even have to have given the green light, probably was caught off surprise, but the fact that the whole world guesses. It kind of made Iran a frontline state in this conflict, which it always wanted in some sense. So it's ironic, again, that Israeli strategy of opacity now has kind of benefited its regional arch rival Iran at the same time. Eric?
When talking about history and memory, and in this context, I think about the Battle of Algiers, and I think about South African apartheid, I think about the ANC and Nelson Mandela. Do you think armed Palestinian struggle can have comparable memory when we look back at these events, decades down the line? Or do you think maybe like mainstream control of narrative will make that a lot more impossible?
Well, this is the thing, mainstream control the narrative. I think what separates all of these is that, I mean, we do have to admit, a plurality of media we didn't see that in the previous conflicts in the Middle East. So I would say when we talk about mainstream narratives, it definitely exists, but the kind of the decentralization that occurs as a result of social media has made this conflict different than the ones we've seen previously. That much I could say. The watermelon emoji, for example. Yeah. Think about that. When in the previous conflicts could we have a prolific, a kind of the semiotics spread, kind of a language that didn't occur in any previous conflict? That's what I say separates it.
I think in some respects, I think Hamas leadership might regret the level, I would call it a catastrophic success, their operation. That I think my best guess is that they were trying to get another Gilad Shalit to exchange for prisoners, and when the paragliders or when there wasn't a strong Israeli military presence, the young Hamas operatives who thought they were being sent to be a distraction and die, I think they ended up in those kibbutzim and got bloodlust. And I think the violence on civilians, I think they were seeking to capture hostages to exchange, and the fact that they didn't face opposition actually maybe turned the world from sympathy towards the Palestinian people living under occupation towards disgust with the killing of civilians. So I think there have been reports about hostages who've been released saying the guys who captured the Hamas guys who captured them were very brutal, and then they were treated much better and got medical care and food when they were brought back to Gaza. And I think that was probably because Hamas leadership realizing that they messed up and trying to salvage the narrative of a resistance, a militant resistance.
No, you go.
I would love to hear what you have to say.
I actually have something to add to this conversation about what happened and why it happened. It is almost impossible to believe that Israel had no clue that Hamas was preparing some sort of an attack. It's just impossible. The CIA, the Mossad, all the intelligence agencies, etc. given problems that Netanyahu was facing at home, is it not likely that he said, let them come in, let them do their little thing, and then it will give us an opportunity to show who is boss.
Similar things were said about the Turkish coup attempt in 2016. You can
Exactly.
use the attack to strengthen your base.
Exactly. I mean, none of us know it, but I think it makes so much sense given all the elements, including misjudging on the part of Hamas, misjudging on the part of the Israelis, etc., and it goes back to what you were saying about unintended consequences, that not all of these things are pre-planned.
I think they expected escalation in the West Bank during the festival of Simchat Torah, and one Israeli colleague had said they took a lot of IDF troops from the south and deployed them to protect settlements in the West Bank that had more tensions between settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. I think that's another read on it, that they were expecting an escalation, but not from Gaza.
Well, but also, I mean, on the eve of the 1973 war, the intelligence was there. There was a mobilization. There was an Egyptian informant as well. So, yeah, you could have the intelligence, you could have the indications. So it's a couple of things. On one level, at the end of the day, Mossad is a bureaucracy, just like the U.S. There was intelligence on the eve of 9/11. The intelligence gets lost, and you're absolutely right, or the intelligence was there. Either no proper precautions were taken, or there was, again, a blind eye. Let this play out. It might be a lifesaver. All of those scenarios could have occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ibrahim is correct, especially about 73, but because during the 73 war, there was all kinds of intelligence that Golda Meir's government had. But I think it's hard to overestimate how much contempt these military bureaucracies have for the Arabs, actually, and that's I think that stupidity, contempt, and arrogance always explains a lot when it comes to I mean, we're not talking about James Bond here. But it's all there. I mean, those things, and also the calculation that you described, which I think is also interesting and plausible. These things can all go together. So, I mean,
and with somebody like Netanyahu, the personality, and you're absolutely right.
Sure.
That's what happened in Turkey in the aborted coup.
Right.
And the Bush didn't have to do 9/11 to know how to exploit it.
Right.
To establish a firm base of support based on a tragedy. How much time do we get? We are sadly out of time, but I want to thank our guests, Professor al-Marashi and Professor Provence. Thank you.